is Mike,
And I'm Colleen.
this is Colleen. And we lead together.
And we don't always match, I promise.
We're not matching, we're just wearing flannel.
And black jeans.
Okay. We have similar wardrobes. We'll
do.
just say it like that. But our mission as a church is to help people do life different by setting rhythms and values with Jesus at the center. And it's our hope
That this is a safe place for you to explore spirituality, faith, and what a relationship with Jesus looks like.
And a few weeks ago, at the start of the new year, we began a brand new series called New Year, Same Me. And I've been asking the question, like, do any of you feel different this year? Like, you feel like a brand new person? And a couple times I've asked this, and I've gotten like one or two hands. Anybody else want to say like they feel new this year? Okay, that's good. I'm glad. But most of us end up feeling like we're the same exact person that we were just a few weeks ago. And that's the reality. And that's what we're considering throughout this series is that like year after year, we get to like January 1st and we say, this is going to be different. This is going to be a new year. I'm going to be somebody totally, completely new. But very rarely does it actually happen.
And the first 2 weeks of 2024, we've been reminded that the faith that we want this year, we need, it requires us to put in work. And then a connected life, a life with God and with others is a better life.
And this week, as we continue this series, New Year, Same Me, we're getting into an area that might be a little bit uncomfortable. It's a question, though, that I've been asking for several weeks, just in preparation for today. I've been saying, does anybody want to be more generous this year? And you don't have to raise your hand, but like some of us really want to be more generous people. And so today is our chance, our look at like what would it really mean? What would it take for us as an individual, as a church, as a community to be more generous? And now we just have to be honest because that's the best way to go about things in life. But like we don't talk about generosity here very often. And the reason for that is because it's kind of awkward. We feel awkward like talking about generosity. We've sat in churches before where generosity feels like that awkward conversation where you end up saying like, oh man, this is the money talk. And so because of that, like we as a church, we've talked about generosity in terms of like time and talent and not treasure necessarily. And that's because we do feel awkward at times. And we feel like uncomfortable because we're up here and you're down there and we've been in that place before. And so we understand it. And that's kind of like how we're stepping into this morning is like, we don't want this to be that awkward money talk because we've never appreciated that.
No.
And we know that you wouldn't appreciate that either. And so we just also want to acknowledge, like for some of us, talking about generosity, specifically when we talk about money, when we talk about finances, when we talk about treasure, it brings up like that internal like kind of pain. It brings up frustration. Maybe it opens up old wounds and experiences from conversations you've had at other churches or other nonprofits, and it causes you to like be like, oh man, like this is cringeworthy, and then you feel a little bit of shame maybe, or you feel guilty, and like we don't want that for you. We don't want that for ourselves.
No. So today, let's make a promise to each other. We promise to do our best, because I guess we can't totally promise this, but we do our best to not make this awkward. We promise not to guilt you or shame you. Now, the thing that we can't promise is we can't promise that like old wounds or like things that have happened in your past that you won't be reminded of them. But what we can promise is that if you feel those things, like we both honestly want to sit with you and hear your story and hear about those things so that we can know more about you and kind of your story. And it would mean a lot to us if you would be willing to share that. And if you send an email to hello@1128community.org, that comes just to the two of us, and you can email us there.
And the last time that anybody on the platform talked about finances and had like a message on that, there were a couple people that just felt kind of like that uneasy feeling down here. And we really appreciated the emails that we got. That meant so much
And then
to
the
us.
follow-up conversation.
And the conversations that came out of that. Because we don't want you to feel like, man, like, that was just awkward and uncomfortable. Like, we'd love to be able to sit in that with you. And so, like, as we make that promise, we'd love to ask you to make a promise kind of back to us. And that might sound a little bit weird, but would you promise this week to talk to God, honestly, like have a conversation with God about generosity and what that looks like in your life? If you're willing to say, yeah, like I'll talk to God. I'll spend time reflecting on generosity and what that means. Like, would you just say that out loud? Like, could we all maybe say that? I've even got it ready here on the screen, so that way you don't even have to think. Like, what do I say? Right? If this is you, if you're willing to talk to God this week about generosity and what that means for you, why don't you just say this out loud with me? I promise to talk to God about generosity this week. And I think that really ultimately at the end of this message this morning, my hope is that this is the thing you leave with most. That you honestly are willing to sit down and have a conversation with God about generosity and what that looks like in your life. And I'll be honest, we've been having conversations with God all week about it because this is important stuff. And one thing just for you to have like ease of mind, while we're talking, Tim and Nikki are sitting right here in the fourth row, right in the middle, and I asked them if they would just throughout this whole entire morning just pray for us, pray for you all, pray for our hearts, that God would really speak to us in this. And so you can know that there are two somebodies in this room right now praying that God would be the one to speak to each of us. That God would be the one to open our hearts and minds. That God would be the one to provide any healing that needs to happen. And ultimately, that we would leave here feeling like, man, I need to have a talk with God this week about generosity. Now, there's a story in Luke chapter 9. And it's not a story necessarily about finances or money, but there's some principles and there's some truths, I think, that we can understand and learn about what it means to be generous. Because the truth of the matter is, like, generosity is not about what you give. It's not about a 10%. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about a heart. And if you're willing to trust God with what you have. And so in Luke chapter 9, we pick up this story and we read in verse 10 that the apostles returned because they had been off, they'd been doing some work. And so they came back with Jesus and they reported to Jesus what they had done. And I imagine he was like, oh, that's great. Now, like, we're all kind of tired. Like, let's get on this boat and we're going to go and we're going to go to the other side of the lake there. And he took them with him. And they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds, they learned about it, and they followed them there. They knew, like, they're going to be going over there, and we love to, like, follow Jesus and kind of keep track of where he's at and what he's doing. And so they followed him there, and they were waiting for Jesus when he got off the boat.
And it wasn't like a small crowd, okay? In this passage, it talks about how there were 5,000 men. And you might say, like, why are they just giving us, like, 5,000 men?
Men.
Yeah, I don't think that's how it really was said. But
it was underlined in my Bible.
They were counting. It was not.
I underlined it in my Bible. It stood out to me. There were men.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep going. So normally during that time period, they would just count the heads of households. So this was just like the heads of the households, but in that time period, most households had 5 members. So this could have been a crowd of 25,000 people standing there. Now, to give you just like a bit of perspective, like raise your hand if you've been to Pfizer for something, anything.
Monster Jam last night, maybe.
Okay, you did not go last night, but
I did not.
But there's been a lot of people in this room that go there. Well, this crowd is 7,000 more than what fit into Pfizer Forum. So like Pfizer Forum fits just less than 18,000, but this crowd is even bigger. And if we look back in Luke, we see and we can read about Jesus that he welcomed them. and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing.
And at the end of the day, like Jesus has spent all day with these folks now, the potentially 25,000, the 5,000 men and their households. Like he's spent time with them. He's been preaching, he's been healing, he's been caring for them. He's listened to their stories. He's probably prayed with them. He's really invested a lot of time in these people. And then it gets to be the end of the day, and I imagine the disciples who are with him, they're kind of like, okay, like, are we done yet? Can we move on yet? Like, is our work here done? It's starting to get a little bit late, and now, like, here's what I imagine, like, they're kind of looking at each other and like, okay, who's going to tell him, like, we got to get out of here? Right? Like, 'cause
Not me.
who wants to be the one to tell Jesus, like, hey, buddy, we got to go, right? Like, nobody really wants to tell Jesus it's time to move on. And so they're having this conversation, I imagine, and they're like, how do we do this in, like, the best way possible where he doesn't get upset with us? And so they say, oh, we'll make it all about the people. Right? Like it's not about us being hangry. It's not about like our schedule. It's about them, Jesus, right? Like if we show care for the crowd, Jesus will say, oh, yeah, that's great. And so in verse 12 of chapter 9, it says, late in the afternoon, the 12, after having this very intense conversation among themselves, they came to Jesus and they said, send the crowd away, so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging. Because we're in this remote place here, right? Like Jesus, it's not about us being hungry. It's not about us being tired. It's about them. Jesus, think about them, the people that you've been spending all day with. Like they need to go and find food. Jesus, they need to go and like find a place to sleep because we're out here in the middle of nowhere and like they need to be taken care of. Jesus, like think of them first. And it makes sense, right? Because like, yeah, we need to think about them. But Jesus replies, well, you give them something to eat. That's not what they're expecting here. Like they're thinking like Jesus would say like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we should kind of wrap it up for the day. But no, Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And then they answered, the disciples, they answered, well, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And unless we go and buy food for all this crowd, and with inflation, like food today is like so expensive and like we can't afford to feed these 25,000 people. That's not what they're expecting here.
But there's this thing that John writes about that happens in between those 2 verses that Mike just read that Luke doesn't tell us. So in between like the disciples going to Jesus and Jesus saying, well, like you buy them something, John writes, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Now, this is the only time that we see Jesus testing anyone, and Jesus tests Philip. And do you know there's only one thing that God tells us to test him into, and it's tithing. Generosity with our finances, and the only test that Jesus ever gives is in that like same category of generosity.
Now, if you're at all like me, you're like, okay, why Philip? Like why is he picking on poor Philip here? Right? Like there's all these other guys that, we hear about and we read about often, and like they probably deserved a little bit more of like this testing. Like why is he choosing Philip to test? And I looked it up because it was interesting to me. Philip, if you didn't know, is a Greek name. And the only other time that we hear about Philip is in the temple. When the Greeks, some people that weren't with Jesus, these Greek people, they weren't Jews, they weren't part of the crowd that was with Jesus regularly. These Greeks, they said to Philip, hey, you're kind of like us. Can you introduce us? Can you escort us to Jesus? Can you help us know this guy that you're hanging out with? Like what we see here is like Philip had some sort of like connection to people that were outside the inner circle. There was an openness and a willingness. There was something about who he was that the Greeks were like, oh, he's relatable. we can trust him, and maybe he'll introduce us to Jesus. And so Philip, he shows openness, he shows a willingness to these outsiders, and that's ultimately why Jesus ended up testing Philip, because he wanted to know, well, how open is Philip? How much is Philip willing to do to invite outsiders in? What's Philip willing to give so that people who aren't here feel welcomed here? What is Philip willing to sacrifice so that outsiders can have access to me? And the thing about Philip is he wanted nothing more than for people to know Jesus. He wanted nothing more than for people to experience the compassion and the love of the man that he was following. He wanted nothing more than for outsiders to become insiders. And so Philip, and he eventually partners up with Andrew, another disciple, and they find this little boy. They see he's got a couple loaves of bread and a couple fish. And like I always think of like fish, like big fish, like something you catch in a nice river, like a salmon or something. Like they were probably talking like little fish, like something that you're going to make, a small little sandwich out of. He finds this boy and they say, hey, we need your lunch. We got to feed some people and I'm not sure how it's going to work. And would you let us use this? Well, Jesus wants us to do something here. And they bring this lunch to Jesus, and what happens next, you all know the story. It's beyond incredible. There's really not words to describe what happens next.
But we can read in Luke that Jesus, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and he gave thanks and broke them. In Luke 9:16, we see very clearly that when we give something to Jesus, he will bless it. We see this happening right there. We see the meal given to him, and Jesus thanks God for it and blesses it. And then, if we continue reading, then Jesus gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. Jesus didn't hold on to it. But Jesus gave it to them. Jesus gave it to the disciples. He gave them the fish and the bread to continue giving away.
And what I love about this is that he took it and he blessed it. He gave thanks for it. And it reminds me of that meal he had that we call the Last Supper. He took the bread and the juice. He gave thanks for it and he blessed it. And he said, this represents my body. The miracle didn't happen in the bread and the juice. The miracle happened on the cross when he gave of himself so that you and I could know the Father. Similarly, like the miracle doesn't happen when we hold it in our hands. The miracle happens when we give it away. The miracle will never happen when we hold on to it. The miracle only happens when we give it away. The miracle happened because Jesus gave that bread and fish and allowed it to go to all those that needed it. The miracle happened because Jesus gave of himself, gave his body and his blood so that we all could experience life. The miracle does not happen when we hold on to it. The miracle happens when we have a willingness and an openness to give it away. And it's not just about those 5,000 people or 25,000 total that were fed, right? Like verse 17 says, and this is the miracle, that they all ate. Yes, they all ate. They were all satisfied. And when I think satisfied, I mean like there wasn't like I need something else.
No, they were stuffed.
They were stuffed. They were satisfied. They were happy. They were feeling good. And then the disciples, they picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Like not only were they stuffed, not only were they feeling good, but like there were leftovers. Like this was a Thanksgiving meal where like there was lots of leftovers and we're having sandwiches for the next couple days, right? Like they were satisfied. And why were there 12 extra basketfuls? Well, obviously there's 12 disciples, right? Like Jesus, I think, had 12 extra basketfuls of fish and bread because he's trying to teach these 12 guys a lesson.
Now, we're not saying that if you give to God, your blessing is going to be financial. We're not saying that. Now, it sometimes is, but that's not the promise. The promise is that you cannot outgive God. The promise is that you cannot outgive God, because as you give, he will pour and heap on you. And maybe there's a lesson that you need to learn. Maybe you're feeling tested too, just like Philip. God believes that you are able to give, and God believes that you have the ability to help, like give access to him, like to people on the outside, like those that need Jesus. And you might say, well, like, I don't know, I'm just not giving because I just don't think that like my gift is going to make a difference. And I like to think about this boy, this little boy with his little lunch, and the difference that that made.
And maybe you're sitting here thinking, well, my gift is so small. It's less than a couple fish and a couple loaves of bread. Like that's not going to make a difference. This is going to sound rude. I want to preface that. Mostly because Colleen tells me after I say things like, that was rude.
I do.
So I just want you to know, like, this is going to sound rude, but I want you to hear it. If you're thinking I can't make a difference, you're completely right. You can't make a difference, right? Like, you don't make the difference. God makes the difference. And it does not matter if you give a little or you give a lot. You're not the one making the difference. You're the one giving to the difference that God is going to make. That should be inspiring to you. That should take a burden off, very honestly, because like you're not the one responsible to make the difference. God is.
And when you show like that faith, like with your finances, like when you show that loyalty to God, God can do extraordinary things. And I love that of like the miracle doesn't happen when we hold on to it, because it's like, well, when you let it go or when you offer it, God can do extraordinary things. And even with the smallest lunch.
Yeah, and here's the thing, like I said this earlier, like generosity, giving, it's not about what we give. It's not big or small. It's not a percentage. It's about giving from a place of trust. It's giving from a place of, I'm going to honor God with what I have been given. It's coming from a place of saying, I want to do this cheerfully. And I've been sitting on a story for a couple weeks now, and I wasn't sure if it was going to fit into the message. It's not even in the notes, but it feels like it's supposed to fit in right here. Back in November, early December, I was having coffee with a friend, John, and we were sitting down and having a chat, and he said, we want to start giving to 1128. And I was like, that's great, John. Tell me a little bit more, because like you don't come to 1128. Why do you want to give your money to a church that you don't live near, a church you don't attend, a church where you only really know us? Why do you want to do that? And he said, well, the church that I go to, like, I'm just a little unhappy with like some of the things happening there, and I really think that my money would be better used at 1128. And I was like, John, as a pastor, I think I'm obligated to say thank you. But at the same time, like, I'm also obligated to ask you, have you prayed about this? Have you trusted God with your money? Because honestly, as much as we would love for you to partner with our church, like it doesn't feel right to receive gifts from somebody that's upset with a different church or a different organization, because you're not giving from a place of a right attitude, a right heart. God can do more with your money when you give from this place of having a right heart. God doesn't ask you to give so that you feel obligated. God doesn't ask you to give in a way that you feel like, man, I have to give, and I have to give a certain amount. Like God really wants you to give from a place of wanting to honor him, a place of wanting to trust him. And I told John, and we talked about it again this week, and I was like, hey man, I'm going to share this story about you. And he's like, that's awesome. I love that you get to share that story, because he hasn't ended up giving to the church. And that's great, because I think what he and his wife have decided is God's asking us to trust in a new way, in a different way, and to allow God to use our financial gifts to bless the church where we are. And if I'm being completely honest, like that's what we want. We want not only the people in our church, but the people outside our church to give where God would want them to give. Now, the reality is, I said this earlier this morning already, like we're a church that's just a startup church in some ways, and we're starting to come of age. There comes a point in a new church life where you have to grow up, and we started growing up. We've got a church board now, woo! And some of the other things that we need to grow up in is our budget. We need to be a church that's able to sustain that on its own. For the last couple years, we've had several churches, like 10 different partner churches that have given to us and helped us do what we do. Over the last 3 years, those churches have given us more than $200,000 to offset the difference in what the budget is and what we actually bring in. This year, year 3, those dollars, they start to slowly go away. And by the time we get to August, there will be $0 coming in beyond what's already come in from outside organizations. And that's a little bit scary, if I'm being honest. But ultimately, as we were praying about this way back in November, God gave me, I think, a really cheesy phrase. And it's going to sound cheesy, and I apologize again for the cheesiness of this, but God gave me this phrase, 24 more in 2024. And I think there it is, 24 more in 2024. And ultimately, as I was thinking and as we were praying about this, we were like, man, what would it look like if each of us or each household was to give $24 more per week in 2024. It sounds weird, it sounds cheesy, but when I did the math, after coming to this conclusion that God had given us this, 24 more households that said yes to, I'm going to give $24 more a week, would be the exact dollar amount, that $30,000 that we've received last year that we won't receive this year from partner churches. If 24 households said, yes, we're committed to giving $24 more a week. And more might mean I've been giving $0 and I'm going to start giving $24 a week. More might mean I've been giving $100 and I'm going to do $124 a week. More is a number, and you know how that fits. But what I've discovered is God gave us this, and I think that God wanted to put this in front of us to show us trust me. Trust me in a new way, and I'll cover the difference. Trust me in this little thing, and I will multiply it. Trust me in this way, and outsiders will be invited in. The church will continue to thrive, and you will be able to help people do life different.
And most importantly, when we give something to Jesus, He will do what you and I can never do, because He will bless it. Like if we're willing to give, he will bless it.
And that's what it's all about. It's about releasing what we have. Maybe it's $24 a week, and trusting that God is going to multiply that and change Oak Creek, change our surrounding area. God's going to multiply that so that we can help more churches start, so that we can move into a space where we could be a community hub. God is going to multiply that so that we can help feed the hungry, take care of the widows, and expand the family. And that is what it's all about. That's what generosity is all about. It's not a dollar amount, although this is a dollar amount that maybe God's asking you to commit to. It's not a percentage. It's a heart position, a willingness to trust God and to say, yes, God, help me be more generous in 2024. God, I know you want me to be generous this year. Would you pray with us?
God, thank you for what you do give us. And help us each have a moment with you this week where we can talk with you about our heart and where we're at and generosity. Help us each stop and pause. God, thank you for what you're doing here in Oak Creek, here at 1128. And help us be a people that are following you, and so that we can show others who you are. God, we open our hands this morning. Help us be generous people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Hey, as we wrap up our morning, I did want to just reiterate, if there was something this morning that didn't sit right, don't take that and run away. We'd love to talk about that. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to process that alongside you. You can email us at hello@1128community.org, and that's going to be just to us. No one else will see that email, and we could set up a time to grab a coffee or to have a dinner or a Zoom call. But we don't want you to feel uncomfortable or awkward. Our hope is that you would spend time with Jesus discovering and asking, how can I be generous this year? So as we wrap up, let's stand, let's sing, let's close out together.